Welcome to the first episode of the TCM Challenge, a monthly movie review podcast where Matt and I challenge each other to watch some classic films. This month's movie is the 1960s confusingly titled Purple Noon, and I'm Matt in Buffalo.
And I'm Matt in Arizona.
All right, Matt, welcome to the first official episode of our new venture here. And I'm going to say, I think we got a really fun movie to start out with. I'm going to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion because, obviously I've never seen this movie before and I'm kind of a newbie to this whole uh, universe that this character exists in.
Yeah, I'll own up to not even knowing this movie existed prior to coming up with the conceit for this show and pulling the random bits of 5 movies to select from. But when I saw this movie was even a thing, I'm like, oh, well, hell, this has to be the selection. So just going back real quick, let's refresh everybody if you missed our kickoff episode. The conceit of the show is we pull 5 random movies from a month that are going to be airing on Turner Classic Movies, pick out 5 of those at random, and then we rotate back and forth monthly, picking out which one of those that we want to subject each other to watch, and then we just dive into it from there. So the first month selection that I got to pick from was 1957's Silk Stockings, 1951's Experiment Alcatraz, which, by the way, we talked about it. That was so much more boring than what we had maybe hoped it would be.
Maybe we dodged a bullet then.
It's just early 1950s kind of dull radiation paranoia movie.
Okay.
Right. The little, obscure movie Vertigo from 1958 and 1947's Life with Father. But the winner here was Purple Noon from 1960, which I think I owe a bit of a justification to why I selected this, is because this was the first film version of the 1950s novel, The Talented Mr. Ripley. And I think, for certainly you and I, the much more famous version of this is the 1990s Jude Law, Matt Damon. Yeah. Movie, which is quite a bit more, closer in a lot of ways to the original book. But I was just so interested in a book from the 50s written by a woman who was very famous for tons of crime novels, a French 60s interpretation of that, and then a 90s American interpretation of all the same material that has a lot of weird crime and sexuality elements. And I was just super interested to see how these different media, different eras, and different cultures would kind of interpret the same source material. And as part of the preparation, I just got excited about this. I went out and got the book, went through that really quickly. I watched this movie, and then I watched the Matt Damon one all in quick succession. So I will warn you, I've been in Tom Ripley's head for quite a while. I might kind of interchange and conflate the different versions of this going forward.
Being in Tom Ripley's head, watching this movie, that's kind of a dangerous place to be. But I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to you filling me in on some of the blanks of the background because, I've not read the book. I hadn't seen this movie until this watch through, but I have a confession. I've not seen the Matt Damon movie. I was going to watch it in comparison to this, but I just didn't have the time. I still will watch it, but...
Sure. And both of them are fairly lengthy movies that are kind of heavy. They're not just throw on in the background kind of a thing. They're very character focused and nuanced. And
Right.
I was really happy with that. Like I said, that was one of the things that I was kind of looking for, of like modern sensibilities of like interesting, deep characters. And I think one of the things that we want to kind of do with this is, if we're going to find new movies to us, I think we want to kind of level set around what some of the comparable, more famous or more recognized movies from that era are, to kind of level set on where our movie kind of fits in with what was the big things at the time. So this should be a common thing going forward on the show, but the top box office movies of that time are quite a bit more famous and, remembered, I would say. Number 1, Spartacus.
Stanley Kubrick.
Yep, which he basically disowned. That's an aside. Um, Two, which is an interesting, I would say, partner to this, Psycho.
Yeah, that when I hear the word the year 1960 and you ask me to think of film, Psycho is the first thing that always comes to my mind.
Yeah. And then, those are the two big ones going down from there: Exodus, Swiss Family Robinson, The Alamo, The World of Susie Wong, which I was not familiar with. Going down further, you have your Academy Award winning picture of the year, The Apartment. Um, what a lovely film that
Love
is,
that
by the
movie.
way. Right.
Yes.
And then Ocean's 11 kind of really rounding out the top 10 for notable movies. But I think that's kind of like an interesting level setting thing, because you kind of get your crime movies of the box office splash one, which is like Ocean's 11, and like murder character driven psychopath,
Right.
Psycho. Right. So I think it's kind of an interesting time frame for this interesting French take to kind of live in.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to how this came about, only because you said you read the book and you've dived into the material. This is not a French property, right? This was written by someone who's not French.
No, I'm Patricia Highsmith. I'm
Right.
pretty sure she's an American, and she's very recognized. Like tons of her material have been made. Notably, "Strangers on a Train," I think, was the one that
Yes,
predated this.
I know I've heard her name before. I just didn't know in connection to what.
Yeah, and quite frankly, a huge Tom Ripley universe of books after. This was the first book of like four, five more, which it's kind of like this book was so interesting, kind of perfect as itself. I didn't have much interest in pursuing the character anymore, so I think
Right.
I'm done with that. But it's a very interesting book, and it makes a lot of sense for that to be put into a movie. And I would say the character stuff in the book, and we'll get into it, is felt kind of ahead of its time, and like really, really interesting.
Yeah, there are things that come up in this movie that I was surprised was in a movie in 1960. But
And I think there's stuff in here that I'm not surprised it's in a movie in 1960. Maybe more of the stuff that was omitted, or how they changed stuff from the source material. And I want to be very careful here in how we look at the movies, and the book, because they're all different pieces of art. I
right.
don't want to be that snob saying the book is just always better. It just isn't, right? They're two different mediums. You have to tell stories fitting the film medium versus a book medium. But there's some core elements there that are interesting
Right.
that
And like I
that go
said,
between the two.
I do want to hear about how some of the stuff from the book translated to this, because I mean, in reading up, doing a little research, I knew that this was not originating from a French property or a French book or French literature. So I'm kind of curious to see, was there anything culturally that was different from what the original book was into this movie.
If I had to kind of guess, like reading about um, the director going into this, I think that kind of morally flexible. um, I'll give it very generously. That kind of a character, I think that character study is what appealed to the very French kind of mindset of
Right.
that time, of exploring that element. So, do we want to kind of like start working our way through the plot and start talking about how the characters kind of interact right immediately? I would say from the beginning of the movie.
Sure, we could do that. I just one more question. Any idea why this was called Purple Noon?
Yes and no. The title is a lift from a poem,
Okay.
just something about a purple noon. I think thematically it's put in there because the French title is Plein Soleil,
Soleil. Yeah.
full sun, right? Bright sun. Because this is one of the things, is like, this is like the direct opposite of a film noir, right? It's not shadowy, it's in harsh daylight,
No,
bright
everything occurred.
Italian sunlight.
All the action, including when we get into the murders here, all happened in broad daylight.
Right. So I think it's a a cheeky kind of a thing of, it's all this horrible stuff happening and this deceit and these vile crimes happening in broad daylight. So it's during the brightest part of the day, a dark theme happening in it,
Right.
like a murky noon, but yet in bright sun, right? So I think it's like a play on that.
No, that makes sense. I was just curious. We can dive in.
Right. So right off the bat will be one of the big things that I'll kind of point out of like it's interesting. The books and the 1990s movie show all the background of Tom Ripley being in the United States and being kind of a low level, probably mostly harmless sleaze, doing like low level kind of scammy stuff, but not overtly like wildly criminal, but like call scam kind of stuff of like your warranty's expired kind of 1950s version stuff in the book.
Interesting. So the book starts off with him having the penchant for crime.
The book literally opens of him running from a bar going to another, worrying that police are following him,
Very
and you never
interesting.
quite know why. And you find out it's like low level mail fraud bullshit,
See, that's
right?
so cool because I mean, I don't want to get ahead of what you're trying to set up, but you don't get that from the beginning of this movie. You start this movie and you basically know nothing about Tom Ripley other than the fact that he's American and he was apparently sent by some guy's father over to bring him back to San Francisco for money. But
Yeah.
you know
So
nothing about him.
the real high level plot, a rich playboy, Dickie Greenleaf, or Philippe Greenleaf in this movie, is the playboy son of a shipping magnate in the US. And he just goes off, screws off to Europe to pursue his half-assed artistic career. And the dad wants somebody to go over and convince the son to come home. And he stumbles on Tom Ripley to go over there thinking that Tom Ripley was a great old friend of his. And depending on the version, there's some level of truth to that too. They were complete strangers. The movies, the books all kind of play around with that a little bit. Doesn't really
Hmm.
matter. But the father sends Tom Ripley over to try and ingratiate himself with Greenleaf, the son, to come home to his mother. And the book and the Talented Mr. Ripley 1990s version show that in him going over there. And the subversion to what you might expect is there isn't a big reveal that, I'm over here playing your father's thing. Tom Ripley basically comes up to him right away and goes, "Hey, your dad sent me here. Let's screw around with him and steal some money from your dad and living up
Uh-huh.
on the Italian coast."
So he lays all his cards out on the table immediately.
Right, which to maybe this film's credit, Purple Noon, you jump to them straight in Rome. I
Oh
think it
yeah,
was
no,
Rome, right?
this is
Just
like
screwing
in
around.
media res. It's like in the middle of action. They're on their vacation, and like I said, it's so interesting to know that the book opens with him having a background in petty crime. Because, like I said, you start this movie and you don't. At least to me, to someone who's not even seen the '90s version, he's kind of a blank slate. Tom Ripley.
Yeah, and where the true interest and where it is in my mind, totally worth someone's time to watch this movie, watch the other one, and read the book, because they are three different interpretations of the same character. And that's where it's like there's no value to it. I don't think any one of them is better, but I think there's fundamental differences between each one of them, and it's
Yeah,
really interesting. It's really really interesting to me. I got like excited of like seeing how each one of these eras, cultures, times, or mediums decided to interpret that. So when they're in Rome, I think you start seeing some of the immediate like themes of the movie come up, and I think you start seeing some clear character stuff. Philippe Dickie Greenleaf in this,
hmm
you see pretty much immediately. I think he's a real bastard.
he is. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
mean, he starts off kind of like a drunk frat boy kind of type, and then just devolves from there.
Yeah, and like one of the first like true character things you see of him is him and Tom. They're in Rome just having a guy's weekend, screwing around, cavorting, getting drunk, just blowing money. They interact with a blind man on the street, and they're not cruel to him per se, but they give him some money to take his cane, and then just kind of behind his back, kind of, I wouldn't say directly mock him, but it's one of those themes of the movie emerges immediately of identity fluidity and
Theft,
where
yeah.
you're at, right?
Yeah, and then they immediately turn around, take that cane, and use it to start pulling their own tricks, including trying to pick up women.
Yes, and how uncomfortable did you get with how it was Philippe, Tom Ripley, and that woman, and how they were just making out in that carriage of the
I,
third wheel of Tom Ripley in there?
you know, it was strange. I'll give it that much, but I also kind of watched it on its own merits because I didn't know if that was more of a time thing. I didn't know if it was more of a European thing where something like that is seen as less risque or taboo. But looking at it from, obviously an American perspective, yeah, it's a little weird.
Yeah, it was Tom's just kind of third wheeling, literally coming over the top of the woman, trying to
I
like,
mean, it's a menage a trois kind of thing.
kind of, yes. But this is where like some of the movie's sexuality, I think, did get hung up on the time,
Oh,
even with it being French.
see, and it's so funny. I don't mean to take us off track, but you mentioned sexuality, and I'm kind of curious to see if the other versions of this material kind of touches on this. When I started, Philippe and Tom interacting with each other and kind of palling around together, they both come on screen. Their clothes are kind of open. Their shirts are unbuttoned down and stuff like that. And it's not like I try to read a gay subtext and everything, but there was definitely, I almost kind of wondered if they were bi. They have kind
So
of this. Their interactions are not sexual, but I felt like there was some innuendo there for 1960.
So we're going to go all over on this podcast, but I'm happy to jump into this now because this might be the main discussion of the podcast, right? Because that is a huge element
Okay,
to
so I'm
to the
I'm
three
glad I wasn't
stories.
I'm glad I wasn't just reading into it because I was definitely picking it up.
No, so I wanted to ask you. It's one of my notes because I was going to ask you to like apply your well-tuned gaydar to this situation of now cutting beyond, jumping beyond just this initial interaction. There was a number of scenes where that type of thing can be kind of interpreted in here, and I went through and read some historic um, uh, reviews in the movie from different times, and I'm curious to like see where we line up on this. So just staying within Purple Noon, where do you think Tom's sexuality lies, and where do you think Philippe's lies? Because I don't think there's any wrong answer. This is now really in the realm of your and my interpretations.
So the way it played out to me was I think Tom's sexuality kind of goes where the wind takes him because his that sticks with his character throughout. He kind of does things impulsively and just but he's so good at what he does that he's able to pull it off. But the way I interpreted their relationship at the beginning was that they're obviously palling around together. I felt like Tom was more in love with Philippe than Philippe was in love with Tom. I felt it was more unrequited. The way I view Philippe is that he's just a playboy, kind of like you said, a kind of a bastard who, probably I think was aware that Tom was harboring something for him, and kind of just played along with him just to fuck with him, kind of thing. Because we obviously find out he's in some kind of relationship with this woman Marge. So I think he's doing. I think Philippe is doing it for the attention. I genuinely think that Tom might swing both ways, depending on how the mood strikes him.
So specifically in there, the scene where after they get back from their boys' weekend in Rome, one of the scenes is you see Philippe go back to in this what fiance serious girlfriend, right? Like he has
Right.
a boat named after Marge, right? They have their interaction, presumably, have sex, whatever. During that time, Tom goes off to Philippe's room to dress like him in Philippe's
Yeah.
clothes and does like it's I think one of the more standout scenes of the movie. He takes on Philippe's character in the mirror and starts making out with a reflection of himself.
Right.
Did you interpret that as like a sexual element to it, or more like creepy psycho kind of, this is just unsettling rather than clear sexual innuendo?
I took it as, it's hard to say because I took a little bit of both, and I know that's kind of a cop out answer, but I did feel that this was showing some kind of obsessive, thing that Tom has where he's basically worshiping the ground that Philippe walks on to the point where he wants to be him. Because, like I said, in this movie, you have no inkling that he has a background in crime the way you do in the book. I think if I had that information, I would have thought of it differently.
Yeah, and so I have like so many thoughts about this. I couldn't be more happy that this was a movie we selected first, but hopefully I have enough focus to hit everything. And then the other one was, I read a review, a near contemporaneous review, I think, by Roger Ebert, talking about once they get onto the boat, the sailboat. He says that like the gay subtext here is so strong, it's clear that Marge is the third wheel to the relationship, and how Tom and Philippe interact is the true relationship there, and
Yeah.
how they like bicker so much with that. It's like a lover's bickering. And this is where I'll be kind of honest. I really did not get um, gay vibes from Tom in this at all. If anything, I thought he was playing it totally straight.
Now, is that because you had previous knowledge of the character, though?
So that's where it's interesting. Where again, I don't think any of these interpretations are wrong, but
No, no, of course not.
in the book, the author Highsmith goes out of her way to say that she does not think Tom Ripley is gay.
Right.
The thing is, like, this is, I think we talked about this on UP2. At a certain point, characters can kind of become their own thing and they go beyond just what the author says. So, respecting her, I think she's wrong. I think Tom Ripley in that is gay, but maybe very focused, and that he's a Dickie or Philippe asexual.
Right.
He's in love with one specific person, and that's Tom. Or
Even if it,
it's Dickie. Sorry, excuse
right.
me, the names.
No, no, I get you. I'm just saying, like, even though you say that you didn't really pick up on that this movie, there's some level of infatuation that I
Oh,
think Tom
yeah.
has with Philippe. Now, whether you want to call it, sexual attraction or not, I guess we can be of two minds here. I saw it, but I have less context of the character than you do.
And then the 1990s version, it's hitting you over the head with it. Tom Ripley is gay in that movie.
Okay,
Like, there's no subtext to it. It's overt, which is fine, and that's what I said. It's just three
it's an
interpretations of the same
interpretation,
character,
yeah.
which is awesome. It's exciting to watch that, right?
But clearly,
But
there must be something there because I'm not the only one that saw it.
so,
Even if you and I disagree, other people have seen it.
oh yeah, no, it totally could be there. It there is definitely versions of it there, but I think a lot of that infatuation, and this is where I'll like one of the few times where I'll say the movie completely misstepped, because one of the big things in certainly the book, because it's omniscient first person, you're in Tom Ripley's head, so you're hearing all his internal thoughts. That's where it's
Okay,
like it's different mediums, so you have to show things and do things different.
right.
But one of the central things of that is he is from a poor American, with a capital A, American background. And one of the huge elements of the book is he's in love with Tom, but also in love with Tom's lifestyle
You mean
in
you mean
the
Dickie?
European. Oh, Dick. Yeah, sorry, the names with Dickie or Philippe's lifestyle so much in the European like elitism and that whole scene. He's in love with that as much and the same as the individual, and I don't think he can separate them. And
Mhm.
where I think this movie kind of is wrong, or it's unfortunate, the movie is outrageously, every character is French.
Moi je suis fatigué. Je suis français. I am French. Je suis fatigué. And I am dark. Parlez-vous français? You speak French. Non, mais ne le faites pas. You don't. Fuck you.
Right. And that is something like you can't quite get around. That whole element of just that allure of living in Europe and being part of that living European style of like the dirt poor
Yeah.
American, they're already that.
I mean,
That's kind of tough.
the less I sound like a, stereotypical American, the better. But I mean, I kind of had to suspend disbelief because I knew, because just based on the description of the movie, that Tom is supposed to be American.
Oh, they
Um,
all are. That's the thing.
See, I didn't get that.
Marge is
I knew that Tom was supposed to be American, but I thought the rest of the characters were European.
no, like all the principal characters. It's Marge is like from Ohio, right? Dickie is San Francisco, or Philippe. That's the thing. It's like, man, like, why did they have to
See, but
change it to Philippe and make him even more French?
See,
Right.
but I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that they couldn't do it, but just by it being a byproduct of being a French movie and a French production, I don't know how you could have avoided that.
It's one of those things where you kind of have to just roll with it,
I
but
did.
it's
I
it's a
did.
whole element to the character of like it's intertwined with the sexuality. It's the cultural difference too, that
Okay.
it's just like, well, that's just unfortunate. It's just something that they couldn't quite
Yeah,
incorporate, and
that's the
it's
thing is like you mentioned that that there's a cultural difference that he ended up falling in love with. You really don't get that in this. I mean, I
right.
got the fact that he was American, quote unquote American, but nothing about his lifestyle difference except for the fact that I think his Philippe's friend at one point just says he's a charlatan and lives from dollar to dollar or something like that, or doesn't have any money.
Right, which is something in all the versions that's kind of a known open secret, right? Like he's got no money, and it's like, but that's like the joke that they're collectively playing on Greenleaf's father,
Right, but that's the
right?
only reference that you get into this movie that he may be of a different financial class.
So
Really?
yeah, there's like an interesting story I wanted to kind of ask. Like, this is where I kind of I want to talk about Philippe's character here,
Hmm.
because I was really thrown off by one conversation. So it's when they're in the galley having uh, lunch, dinner, whatever.
Yeah,
And Tom is telling a story about him and Philippe growing up, and he was the poor kid on the wrong side of the track being friends with the rich kid, and the whole time he's not knowing how to use a knife, right? And at a certain point Philippe corrects him on how to use the knife,
yeah,
shames him in front of Marge. And by the way, just as an aside, Tom does a cool fu. After he gets shamed and embarrassed, he stands up, takes off his shirt, reveals his Adonis like body and beauty in
yeah.
front of Marge.
There's a lot of shirtless men in this movie. I was very into that.
Oh, quick aside, every review I've ever read of this talks about how beautiful Tom Ripley's the actor is. Elaine Delon, I
Hmm.
think. Are Did he do it for you? I gotta
I mean,
ask.
he's attractive. I mean, I was entertained.
Right, but I just like that. Like, that's cool direction of just, all right, you embarrass me in front of this girl, I'm gonna take off my shirt and
Yeah, I want to
look at my
say he
ass.
spends half the movie either with his shirt off or open.
From what I can tell, not many people were complaining about him. He is a
No,
very handsome Frenchist, right?
right.
So, um, in that interaction, though, after he leaves, Philippe is talking to Marge, and he says, "Oh yeah, that story was bullshit. I don't know him." Like, so it's like, wow, what is this relationship that Philippe is pursuing on this because to whose benefit was Tom telling that story? Purely to Marge? Because in that interaction, Tom knew it was bullshit. Philippe knew it was bullshit. And presumably everybody there knows Marge would be keyed in that that story was bullshit. So it's like, I don't think this is miswriting by any means, but it's just like, that is so weird that Philippe is allowing this crazy charade to go on. So is he just keeping Tom around just to F with his father? Does he like having this weird potentially? Because at this point, the danger of Tom isn't evident, right? So like, where is Philippe's motivation in keeping this? Probably he agrees with Freddy, this leech, like around. It added just such a weird, interesting layer to Philippe as well.
See, to me, that's why I say I think it was kind of a vanity thing on his part. I don't think when I felt like Tom had some kind of attraction to Philippe, I think Philippe just liked the attention and the fact that Tom seemingly worshipped the ground that he walked on, and so that he could keep this, pauper around as kind of a pet.
I think you're totally right because the way I was interpreting that, I think there's that sycophant thing of just wanting to have that audience. I also looked at it because this version of Philippe Dickie,
Mm-hmm.
is by far the biggest bastard of any of the three of them because he is just so cruel.
Yeah, I don't get the next part of the movie that we're going to talk about. A, where he basically almost maroons Tom, and then B, throws out Marge's manuscript. I don't understand why he did that. Either of those things.
No, I mean, that's like, this is where
And
he
I
is
had
a tough
to,
character.
and I had to rewind it because I was wondering if I had missed something or I didn't read, because I'm actively paying attention to this movie because I have to read the subtitles. So I kept wondering
Yeah.
if I had missed something.
No, he's just meant to be, or, he's portrayed, he's written as much more of a bully, brute, just impulsive asshole, right?
Yeah.
Where I struggle to see the charm of his character in this, other than just the money, right? Because the first thing you see before you're introduced to Marge is him making out with a stranger in Rome, essentially, right? After he buys the cane from the blind man, encourages Tom to mock him, I suppose.
Right,
And,
but even then, I was kind of like, well, he may just be sleazy. I mean, at that point, I'm just thinking drunken frat boy on vacation, not necessarily like an out and out bastard, but just kind of a sleaze. It's here where it takes a really hard turn for me.
oh yeah, like the so immediately after that, just shaming Tom, who he knows is a stranger, again, just such a weird thing. Tom goes up, screws up steering the boat that the three of them are on, and as I would say, kind of like it was punishment, right? It was a cruel
I guess.
prank. He throws Tom or gets Tom onto the little dinghy and then maroons him, 100 feet behind the ship on a little dinghy in full sunlight, and basically allows Tom to get horribly sunburned and sunstroked.
Yeah.
Right. So this kind of begs the question here, because again, comparing to the books and to the 1990s, I would say the 1990s movie helps the Dickie character quite a bit because
Okay.
he's portrayed by a young,
Jude
godlike
Law.
Jude Law, which, as somebody with an unblemished record of heterosexuality, oh my God, is Jude Law beautiful in that movie. Right. And he is super charismatic, and the Dickie character in that is somebody who is magnetic, like
Okay.
incredibly charming, beautiful, money, the life of a party. Will be the guy up on the stage, like literally in the movie. He's the guy at the party on top of the stage singing and gets
Right.
people up
Okay.
there.
Okay.
But he's like a star that burns brightly. Everybody wants to be friends with him. And then he gets tired of somebody and then casts him away. And
Okay.
that's the Tom thing. That's one of the precipitating events of Tom killing Dickie in that movie, is the the beautiful light of Tom move or of Dickie turned away from him. Right.
Okay, I'm still gonna. You know what? Just talking about this, I'm still gonna watch that '90s movie just so that I can have some comparisons, some background, because that's
Hundred
because that's
percent watch
very
it.
interesting.
Oh, I watched it with my wife. She loved it and wants to read the book now and go back in the reverse of the way that I went through everything here. So totally stands up and just in different interpretations of every character. And I don't know how much we'll talk about Marge because in Purple Noon she's kind of here,
She's
neither here nor there.
she's kind of she's a background character, and yet I feel really bad for her because whatever ends up happening, she ends up losing.
Yes. And in this one, I kind of look at her as just a pawn. The book, she was an obstacle. And in the third one, she actually has some agency because, just,
Right.
better, quite frankly, women characters.
Uh-huh.
Even if they were written by a woman originally, they kind of got better over time. Let's just be real.
I mean, because in this, she gets screwed around so bad. Like I said, in this next scene, for whatever reason, Philippe throws out the manuscript that she's been working on, and
Oh, just a whim, like spoiled brat kid.
yeah.
Right? It's just he thought it would be funny to destroy her work. Which, by the way, another thematic thing. She's writing a book about a monk who changed his identity. Just as
Mhm.
like, yeah, that's a nice bit of
That
subtle
theme.
detail. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's kind of neat. But so I think we're coming up to like the big turning point in the movie. Right? Is to say it overtly, like after Marge is dismissed, Tom kills Dickie and or Philippe in this. And I wanted to ask you here because I think you kind of mentioned it before. You said that Tom maybe acted impulsively or question about his premeditation.
Well, that's what I thought at first, but then
Right.
it kind of takes an interesting turn where they start playing what Philippe thinks is kind of a game, a hypothetical game of if you were to kill me, how would you go about assuming my identity?
Well, going back even further, because can we even go back to
Yeah.
the Rome scene? The first inkling of like, what is Tom up to? The girl that they made out with dropped her earring into the carriage they were with. Tom sees that and just pockets it. And that was the thing. He put it into Marge's or Philippe's coat pocket. Marge finds it, thinks he's philandering, which, by the way, he was. And that's one of the big events that, the throws out the manuscript. She takes off. So Tom did that. And then when there's a scene where Philippe is getting some of his allowance money out of American Express, you do see Tom clearly leering at it, and I think you can do that thing of just the wheels are moving.
Well, see, because at that point, I don't think I had assigned it to the wheels moving. I see it now in retrospect, but at the
Right.
beginning of this, we're told that he's there to bring his Philippe back to San Francisco, and he's got what $5,000 or something waiting for him.
Yeah,
So,
cash on delivery of the son returning.
so the way I interpreted those scenes at the beginning was the fact that this guy keeps screwing around. Tom has to go along with it, and he's taking these little things as recompense for the fact that we're still not back in San Francisco, and I still don't have my money. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And now, but in retrospect, I see what you're saying.
So this is where there's like that really interesting difference between the different media, because in this one, when you downplay the cultural jealousy, the sexual element so much that it may or may not be there, open to interpretation, right? I think then that changes characters' motivations. Because in this, my interpretation was that Tom was doing it purely out of money and a crime of opportunity with a great deal of premeditation. Because he
Right.
engineered Marge's departure to get them alone on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And at that point, he had seen the money. He had been studying. He took some of the bank records, right, for Philippe. So he's already kind of engineering it. In the book and the 1990s version, in the book, so this predates the movie Purple Noon, right? So I think that's a more fair comparison. Tom and Dickie and that are having another boys' weekend out, and they are at an event, and Dickie sees Tom watching a bunch of male gymnasts on the beach practicing, and he sees
Mhm.
Tom leering at them. And Dickie sees it. It is kind of lightly disgusted, but not overtly, like, casting him away.
Mhm.
But then they go out onto the boat together, a little dinghy, and Dickie breaks it to him that, hey, it's been a great ride, pal. We're off on our own. Let's go take care of our own, have our own fun, go our separate ways. It was real. And then just kind of on a whim, Tom goes, oh, I'll kill him and take his identity. And then just brains him. Right. And then that's kind of it. It's like,
Oh,
it's,
so it's more impulsive in the book.
it's impulsive in the book, but like seeing an opportunity in the impulse. The third movie is pretty much clearly a crime of passion.
Okay.
Right. So they hit all the spectrum. So in Purple Noon, I think when they take down the gay jealousy, the shunned lover kind of thing, and kind of pare that down so much, you have to work up the premeditated aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm a dense movie watcher, but I didn't, like I said, I wasn't really putting two and two together with some of those earlier actions. So
Keep in mind,
when
I've watched it twice and I read the novel beforehand.
when
right?
he
So
decides
I picked
to
up on it.
when they start playing the hypothetical game, I was kind of taken aback, and in the sense that, like, I kind of felt like this desire to kill him kind of came out of nowhere because it wasn't really talked about before. I wasn't picking up on it.
Yeah.
At first I was like, is this revenge for him almost being stranded? Was he always thinking this? And I learn more as the movie goes along, but for here it kind of came out of left field for me, which is why I assigned the impulsive moniker to him.
Oh no, I think that's fine, but I think this is where I think the movie is good enough with character stuff and subtle direction. I think there's enough of those hints early on, because it's like at that point the earring
No, you're right. You're
thing is
right.
like, yeah, it's general creepiness. It's going to be a tool in his pocket. He doesn't know where to put it in yet, but once he sees the writing on the wall that he's going to be cut off from the Philippe gravy train, then it's pure premeditation.
Right.
And it's just dollars.
Admittedly, too, not to sound too uneducated, but I think I was so focused on reading what was being said that I was kind of missing the details of what was being done.
Oh, no, but to your credit, like, did you have any idea what the plot was, or did you go into this completely blind?
I mostly blind. I knew it had to do with murder and identity theft, but I didn't know much beyond that.
Right. So it is kind of interesting. Like, there's another theme in this. Like, I don't want to sound like I'm too much of a film scholar, but
No, this is good because you're picking up on the subtleties that I may not have necessarily caught because I'm trying to absorb the story for the first time.
So there's like, maybe this is snobbery stuff, but I sense there's a theme that came out of like, from the sea or on the sea, there's truth. So
Mhm.
when they're out on the boat, Tom is like overtly saying, I want to kill you and take your money.
Yeah.
Right? And
No, and it kind of comes out of nowhere, or at least it did to me.
oh, it's wildly like, wow, they're just going to talk about this. Like, that's kind of crazy. And it's something that we see later in the film when he's walking through the fish market. Things from the sea are like smiling and mocking him. Like, I don't know if that's like
Really?
film nerd me thing, but when he's looking at like the ray
The,
fish,
the ray fish. Oh, okay. Now I get why that scene was there.
I think that's why it's there, because otherwise, why was it there? Right? Like, he's looking at fish mocking him
Right.
because they're from the sea and the sea holds truth. And then once they move to land, like once they go back to land, Tom is lying through his teeth constantly, just manipulating everybody. But on the sea, he was telling the truth.
Uh-huh.
Like, I don't know what to make of that, but
No,
it seems like
that's a
theme.
very interesting theory. I like that.
Right. So plot minutia here. He stabs Tom. or Tom stabs Dickie. Sorry,
Yeah,
I'm an IPA or two deep into this podcast, so
no
it goes
worries.
downhill from here. But he stabs him, wraps him up. Apparently, if you believe, like, I'm convinced half of movie trivia from old movies is apocryphal, but apparently the whole thing about the storm and him falling overboard while trying to dispose of Philippe's body was all improvised, and he never Tom's character was never meant to fall in the ocean, and that was the actor who couldn't swim too well actually fell into the ocean. Who knows? Like, every golden era Hollywood actor did all their own stunts too. It's all
Yeah,
bullshit, but who knows? But anyhow, Philippe is supposedly disposed of into the drink,
he
and Tom
thinks.
takes the boat back in, and the back half of the movie here is a lot of cat and mouse. Like, I don't know how much we need to kind of talk about it because it's quite a bit more plot and
Well, it's kind of like,
intrigue kind of stuff.
yeah, it's intrigue, and it's kind of like separate instances of him almost being caught and him finding a way to evade capture and move on.
Right. So this is where, like, the themes of, like, the I keep wanting to say gender fluidity, but identity fluidity
Right.
come into it quite a bit, right? Because once he goes in, this is now the premeditated plan of him of, I'm going to take on the identity of Philippe, cash his money, send out impersonating letters to string Marge along, eventually leading to dumping her, making it, look like I'm taking off, blah, blah,
No, but
blah, and all that kind of stuff.
I did like the cleverness of some of it, like the fact that he took all the time and he realized all he really had to learn was how to write his signature the way Philippe does.
Right.
The rest can be taken care of by typewriter.
Right. Like, that part I actually really did like,
Yeah, I really
because
liked that.
in the book it's like a throwaway sentence. Like, he took time to recognize or realize how to copy the signature. This was like, one of my favorite things about Coen Brothers movies are their procedural elements of just like No Country for Old Men, of how slow that is, of just watching everybody do every step of the process. And I love that, right?
Yeah,
And
I
this was
loved
some
how
of that.
in this movie you saw it like in that little room how he kept having to write the signature hundreds and hundreds of times before he eventually got it to a place where it looked pretty spot on.
Right. And I'm not sure I would necessarily miss it if it wasn't there. Like, okay, he learned how to forge his signature. Fine. But I appreciate it when it's shown to be in there and the work that was
Well,
put into it.
I kind of like it just from a character standpoint because I mean, of course, the original source material is called "The Talented Mr. Ripley," and throughout the course of this movie, as he's evading capture, he's coming up with things on the spot just because he's that good and he's that clever. So I kind of liked seeing a moment where he had to actually coach himself to do something.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's, like I said, the procedural stuff. So I think he strings Marge along, he comes back, suggests that, Philippe just wants to live in Rome for a while, needs their time separate, all that kind of stuff. Cause it's obviously like a fiery relationship, and
Right, and he's coming up for a reason, coming up reasons why Philippe is not. She's not going to see him.
right. And just trying to keep those identities while constantly kind of the cash in on the money, and just living this two lifestyle of wanting to be in the body of Dickie, but going back into Tom when he has to just cover his ass,
Right.
right, with other people. And I guess the next big milestone event there is there's no red flags. In this movie, Philippe is such a bastard. Like, I don't think this was maybe that hard of a thing to swallow for people. Like, yeah, he's just gonna fuck over Marge and leave when he wants to anyhow. Like,
Well, I
didn't
mean, one
think
of
it
the
would be that
last,
big of a
like what
stretch.
like I said, one of the last things he did when Marge saw him was he destroyed her work. So I
Which,
mean, the fact that he's abandoning her is not that far out from what he was doing.
right. And it's kind of one of those unfortunate things of, like, not every woman character has to be super strong. It's fine to have, as characters for growth, somebody not
Sure,
being strong, but she wants to get back with him right away, even though he was horrible
horrible.
to her. Horrible. At that point, there's no reason for her not to think he was cheating. he was.
Yeah, but they had
still is,
shown
more or
they had
less.
shown him to be so sleazy and sort of manipulative that I didn't necessarily see it as a weakness on her part, in the sense that I just felt like he had manipulated her enough to believe that that's what she needed to do.
Oh yeah, yes, in that regard, she is a character that's meant to be manipulated in this movie, which unfortunately those are real people in the world.
Mhm.
But I think this character got a little bit better, right? With unfortunately Gwyneth Paltrow.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, but because Tom eventually manipulates the shit out of her.
Yeah, when we get to the
Dickie.
climax at the end, I've got questions.
Yes, that's more than fair. But the next milestone, I guess, is Tom as Philippe is living the life in this, really gorgeous, well, I will say kind of gaudy / gorgeous Roman apartment. By the way, one of the things in this movie shot on location in 1960s, 1959 Italy.
Yeah,
Oh
you can
God,
tell.
it's beautiful, right?
Yeah,
It's like you just want to be there. Like you can't beat it. It's
yeah, it's
no
gorgeous.
studio. It's awesome. It's worth watching. Like I said, it's all broad daylight, super bright. It's gorgeous. The Criterion Blu-ray is perfect. So go watch it for beauty, if nothing
And
else.
actually,
Right?
it was the Criterion transfer that's on Amazon Prime, so I got to see every bit of detail.
Mint. Right. So he's living his life, and I think this is like a great scene. And the evidence that this is a really good scene is it's virtually identical in all three versions. Is when
Mhm.
he's living in this apartment, and one of the few people that could identify him easily and unmistakably as Tom Ripley, Freddie Miles,
Yeah,
the fat Slav. They're always so brutal of how they describe this guy, boorish American friend of Philippe, shows up expecting to see Philippe in this apartment,
and
and he finds Tom living in it.
we've already learned from earlier in the movie though that he doesn't like Tom at all. That
Oh, he hates him.
He outright distrusts him.
Oh, Philippe might be, or not Philippe, excuse me. Freddie
Freddie.
might be the most perceptive person
Yeah,
in this because he sized Tom up immediately as a leash, a crappy person.
yeah.
Freddie is just boorish and kind of the loud, obnoxious asshole of a group, right? Ugly, rich money.
Yeah, you kind of get that here. I feel like it's a little bit muted compared to probably what's in the book and what's in the other movie.
Oh, Philip Seymour Hoffman is this guy.
Oh, is it Philip Seymour Hoffman?
Oh,
Okay.
he's
I-
awesome.
That's that's perfect casting, and B, I could see him being loud and boorish, playing
So
that type.
Oh, it's a laugh out loud, hilarious scene, or at least it was for me. In that version, um, Dickie, Marge, Freddie, and Tom are all on the boat together, and Freddie and Tom are up on deck when Marge and Dickie are under in the cabin having sex.
Mhm.
And Matt Damon's Tom is looking down through and just leering, and you could tell it's jealousy of how dare he touch that disgusting woman,
Right.
right? And Freddie sees it, and he just looks over and goes, "Tom, how's the peeping going? How's the peeping going?" And it's just Matt Damon doesn't respond to it.
I am
and it's
really
just
looking.
it's,
I'm really looking forward to watching this '90s movie. If just not for the cast. I mean,
it's awesome.
Philip Seymour Hoffman would be perfect as this role. I can't wait to see that.
Oh yeah, he's perfect, right? But I like Gwyneth Paltrow in movies. I hate her as a person, right? But she's good in this.
She's
too,
not
right?
untalented in movies. We'll put it that way.
Right. But anyhow, when Freddy shows up, this is a nicely suspenseful scene because Freddy
Yeah,
shows
no,
up and in every version of it, he knows what's going on here.
Well, he disappears for enough of this movie that I forgot he existed, and that when he shows up, I was like, "Oh fuck, this is the one person that could fuck this up for Tom."
Right. So this is something I see all over the place. People either saying it or not bringing it up, so I think they disagree. At any point, were you rooting for Tom Ripley?
it's hard to, with just this version in mind, it's hard to say. I want to say yes in the sense that it was exciting to see him try to evade and see him get away with stuff. But I kind of feel like I got enough of his character where I could possibly be on his side, but at the same time, he's kind of more of a blank kind of sociopath in this one. I'm curious to see if other versions would make me feel more that way.
So it's tricky because one, I'll kind of say I like Matt Damon and he has a tremendous amount of goodwill on my part as the person, right? Like I like him as
Right.
like a guy who shows up on talk shows. He's in enough movies that I adore, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to separate that. But the way he plays that character, that's also in there. But it's interesting to like the book, Purple Noon, and the Talented Mr. Ripley movie, the final one. We have here is Freddy, who is, for everything that we know, he might be kind of a jerk, but he's not a bad person
Yeah,
per
and
se.
his jerkish qualities. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that. I can see it, but it's not really emphasized in this movie. He's just another friend of Philippe's who really doesn't like Tom. I don't get the boorishness from him necessarily.
You got to watch the Philip Seymour Hoffman one.
I know.
They
I
should
know.
have given him an Academy Award.
I know. I probably sound ridiculous saying this, but just in the context of this movie, I didn't see it as much.
Sure, but like he's a character, and in any sense, we have a guy now who we know murdered somebody in cold blood.
Yes.
And is now stealing money. Yet you should be rooting against him, and in fact I was, but because it's such like a well-constructed scene and contrived event, you kind of I found myself, I shouldn't project, I found myself like, oh, how is Tom going to get out of this? When I'm like, oh
That's
wait, I
what kind
shouldn't
of
be
where I
doing that.
was.
I shouldn't be doing that.
That's kind of where I was. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say rooting for him. I was very on the edge of my seat to see how he was going to manipulate his way out of this one.
Which it turns out he didn't.
He needs to murder again. Yes.
Yeah, he didn't get anywhere close to it, right? So it's like, and it's a cool thing because in all the versions, he gets Freddy out of the room, and it's like, well, that's not going to be the final solution to this, but immediate problem solved. Maybe I just got to run off to another apartment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looked like he was going to get away with it, and then the maid fucks it up.
Right. And then they go down, and the maid who thinks that's Dickie and or Philippe up there confirms that it's, it's
that's Mr. Greenleaf. He's
shown.
up there. Yeah.
Yeah. So Freddy rushes back up, and in the true impulsive backed into a corner murder, Tom has to kill him. Right?
Immediately. No questions asked.
Right. Just brains him with a Buddha statue in this movie.
I kind of wondered if he was just knocked out at first, but I was like, no, that hit him too hard at the neck.
Oh, and again, just to that detail that's in every one of the movies, I'm pretty sure, is it doesn't kill him right away. And Tom has to reach down and feel for a pulse. And in the book, because it's all internal, it's a thready pulse that he just watches go away. So it's not just...
I figured he kind of like bleeds out internally.
Yeah, so it's like just that little detail of like, okay, the immediate murder, but it's also that follow through of like, I'm literally going to feel you die now.
Right.
And that's creepy. It's great. Right. And then just that procedural stuff of, it's not just, how many other movies in this time, like in Psycho, because we brought it up, do we see him dispose of what's her name's body after he stabs her in the shower?
Yes, you do.
Do we? Shit. Well, there goes my point. But
you do, because don't you remember the whole scene where he comes down and he wraps her up in the shower curtain and then drives the car into the swamp?
I just watched that relatively recently and I forgot. But great, because I think that's still kind of to the point of like the evolution of film at that point of like, it's not just an event. We have to watch him sit with this body for hours.
And it's just as suspenseful too, because I mean, if you remember that scene from that movie, there comes a point where he drives the car into the swamp and then it doesn't sink all the way. So you wonder if he's gonna get caught or not. And then
that's right.
Sinks.
I forgot about that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So
same thing here. How is he going to get this body out of this room convincingly?
Right. And by the way, another little very interesting, astute, artistic whatever direction. As soon as he kills him, he goes over to the window and watches a bunch of children play outside, kind of signifying like his loss of innocence. Just it's snobbery, but there you go. It's just kind of nice attention to detail, right? It's the stuff you pick up on multiple.
That is
meetings.
cool. I mean, I kind of figured he did that too because for him at this point, murder is no thing anymore. You know what I mean?
And again, just like the different mediums, like you kind of see it in this, in that he kills two people and immediately afterwards he just vigorously eats, right? I think kind of showing the lack of conscience with it. Like after he kills Philippe, he eats an apple like an animal. After this one, he cooks, sits down and cooks a chicken.
No, this is where I say it all feels kind of impulsive. Like he's just, it's all about the animal part of his brain, so to speak.
So another cool thing here is you see it depicted here of him kind of internalizing and not really necessarily having that conscience. In the book, you're inside of his mind, and you see he has no guilt over killing these two people.
Yeah.
No, none. He's worried that he'll get caught and have
And I think that translates to here. That's what I picked up on.
Yeah, so that's here. And this is arguable, like if it's doing the character right. Matt Damon has monologues talking about his guilt. And it's like, well, you feel for him, and that's like all that goodwill Matt Damon stuff is well acted. But it's like, should your perfect Tom Ripley be having that feelings or having those feelings? Because the book, it's a psychopath. He has no feelings.
I kind of like the cold sociopath of just having the impulse to satisfy hedonistic things.
Right. So it's like, it's the Tom Ripley for your preference, right? So that's where each one of them are great and have their own value. So you see that procedural thing of him carrying this big guy down, dumping the body. And then it's really that ratcheting of tensions, because in, comparison to Philippe's body, Freddy's body's found immediately.
Yes.
And then you get
because he kind of just dumps him somewhere.
Yeah, behind a crypt, right off the road. Tries half-assingly to make it look like he was mugged.
Right, but I mean, I got the sense that unlike Philippe, he really didn't care that much whether or not Freddy was eventually found.
Is that out of practicality, or is that over care of the person? Because, like, him loving...
Well, I kind of wonder if it's a little bit of both, because he needs to take up the next chapter in his fake Philippe saga, where he's now going to have a reason for Philippe to want to kill himself, quote unquote, because he committed this murder. So in order for the story to be believable, they have to find the body, and make Philippe the number one suspect.
So a lot of intrigue comes out of this, of like evading the cops, because now he has to jump back and forth between Tom or Philippe, depending on the circumstance of, whether it's police interviewing him, whether it's Marge and that kind of thing. So it's interesting of how he's trying to navigate this to pivot the blame, because people can connect Freddy wanting to go see Philippe. So it's how do you make that look like Philippe killed him? It's not a plot hole, but one of the things when I was reading the book, I'm like, oh, the immediate thing that could get out of this is if Tom said, yes, I was having a gay relationship with Dickie. Freddy found out. Dickie was so embarrassed by that, he killed him.
Right.
And then that would explain so much of this, but I don't think Tom could do that because he's in denial over his sexuality throughout it as well. So I don't think that character, despite his cleverness and ability to lie, I don't think he would allow himself to tell that lie. So I don't think that was a plot hole. I think that's a character thing.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't even think of that. Like I said, I just figured after he murdered Freddie that he already started spitting the plot of what's going to happen next to quote unquote Philippe and how he's going to be the number one suspect and he's going to feel so guilty that he kills himself, and that way Marge or no one else asks any more questions about when is he coming back.
And then he forges the, last will and testament,
The
deathbed
suicide letter,
confession,
basically.
suicide letter, saying that leaving all of his money to Marge. And then
Right.
this is where poor Marge, as the third victim of the story, right? Basically, Tom then decides to go back to her and basically abuse and manipulate her into
Yeah,
a
this is the
relationship with
part
him.
that I had to kind of go with because I don't get how she changes here.
This is like, again, there's not many parts of the movie where I think are overtly wrong. Even the ending, which is a wild difference from every other form of the media, which we'll get into. This part, I'm like, this is a bit of a stretch. Like,
Because I mean, especially considering what he does. At one point, he comes in when she's asleep and starts macking on her, and somehow that
and it
translates to
works.
her turning around and forgetting about her supposedly dead fiance. And
I'm not sure I'm able to reconcile this as like, other than saying, well, she's an incredibly abused character that's ripe to get abused again, or
that has to be it because we have nothing else to go on.
or it's a plot shorthand reflecting the time.
Well, yes, I mean outside of the movie, yes, that's true. I'm talking about in the context of the movie, the abused woman is all we have to go on.
Right. And Tom's put all his eggs in that basket that he can just go in there and manipulate her. Right.
Well, sadly, he's not wrong
And
because
as
of
it
what
works out,
happens.
yes. Oh yeah, they become a couple
Yeah.
somehow. Right. And I mean, rapidly going to the end, I do have some like wrap up questions, but this is where I think the theme kind of emerges again, because it's kind of a throwaway line. It's much bigger in the book and the other movie that Philippe Dickey's father is coming in from the United States to close the affairs
Mm-hmm.
down. And part of that is selling the boat Marge, right?
Right.
So as Tom and Marge are having, seemingly Tom's now basically mooching off of Marge because she's the beneficiary of all of the money from
Right.
the inheritance of the presumed now suicidal Philippe.
Believe.
He's now living the gravy train off of Marge. It's
Mm-hmm.
debatable whether I looked at it as he has actually no feelings for her. It's just purely stealing her money. Right.
Yeah. No. The way I look at him by the end of this movie is he's someone who's completely hedonistic that will do anything to satisfy that hedonistic impulse.
Interesting. That's exactly what his character apparently evolves to in the other books. But word for word, that's how they describe his character. So as they're celebrating having just, gorgeous sunbaked thing, you just see him soaking in his apparent victory.
Mm-hmm.
Greenleaf Sr. is pulling Marge, the boat, the sailboat, out of the water into a dry dock. And it's like, this was where it was like mind blowing to me. This was like genuine shock because this is such a departure from the book. What we thought Philippe being just tied up, bound in a canvas or a sail or whatever, and thrown into the ocean. When Tom fell off during the storm, this is where I wonder if it was actually improvised or part of the script, because in all that screw up, the corpse of Philippe is actually got entangled into the propellers and the rudder
Yeah.
of the sailboat. So when it's brought on shore, the camera pans over and you can see the corpse, heavily decomposed, of Philippe is now being brought on the land. From the ocean is coming the truth to be revealed again.
Yeah.
And the last shot of the movie is the police at this point, who we now well know, are calling over like the maid or whoever's attending to Marge and Tom to, tell Tom there's a phone call. So while we don't see Tom be arrested. Presumably, he leaves the screen. You just see this beautiful Italian coastline as the last shot. Presumably, he leaves to get arrested, and
Right.
he's captured for the murder. And you can only imagine Philippe's murder, Freddie's murder. It's all going to come to light. All the identity theft, all that kind of stuff. It's just, it all will unravel in an instant.
Mhm.
Which the Highsmith hated this ending, from what I can tell, because she said it was cowardly people deferring to what the expectation of the time was for morality. Because in the book, he cleanly and flatly gets away
Gets
with
away
it.
with it. Yeah, I was wondering if it had to do with the ties because back, at least during this time in America, there was the Hayes Code, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there was a certain code that said that people who did wrong in the movies had to be caught or had their comeuppance by movie's end. Now, I didn't think that the French were bound to this, but it
From the
feels like one of
interviews,
those endings.
no, from the interviews that I read, it was the director saying that there has to be atonement for this, which to the the book there is none. He has no guilt. He gets away scot
Well, it's
free.
an
And
ongoing series, so I would think not.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you see him compartmentalize. Like at points, like he will catch him. You'll catch him like attributing murder to somebody else. Like he was the one who did it, but he's blaming like Dickie for doing something when it was actually him. So you can see
Right.
he's doing all this mental gymnastics to do it. But it was the director apparently making that decision that it had to be, there had to be some
Yeah, it
repercussions to
just
it.
struck me it just struck me funny that the fact that the the corpse was still tied to the boat. He did everything else in this movie so well to the point where like he was again talented as the original title suggests that I don't buy that he would make that mistake.
Well, that's interesting because it says one of the parts of the character where he talks about it. You benefit from the internal monologue.
Right.
In the book, he talks about like, I have been so unlucky for so long. It's about time that just luck goes my way. And you do. Part of the reason he gets off in the books is just blind dumb luck
Okay.
of incompetent Italian,
I get okay.
investigators and stuff.
This is another instance where context would help, I suppose.
Right. So, there's an element of that, but in the movie, it's a little bit more skill. It's characters not believing other ones. Like Marge never believes him in the movie, like the Gwyneth Paltrow's version. So that's where it's like, well, there's where her character's a little bit better. She sees through this shit by the end, but no, people don't believe her. There's a lot more complexity to it that I don't want to ruin it for you because
I'm excited. Yeah, I'm excited to see the movie. I'm going to check it out later.
It's a third version of this, which is
Right.
I don't want to say better or worse. It's just different and it's
Right.
good, right? So I don't know. Do we have anything on here? Because there's one like hanging thread question I kind of wanted to ask you that's more generalized.
Sure, go ahead. Because we're at the end of the movie.
Yeah, because that's the end of it. And again, it's like that one is like the difference on the ending. That's one of the things I don't want to say it's flatly better in the book versus something else. It's just different, right? And it's totally up to your interpretation.
Right.
Because I don't think it changes the core of a character, where I think
No.
the Frenchiness, changes the core of a character. And like Philippe, Dickie, they're totally different characters, but shit, they're named different, right? So it's
Right.
like, whatever. This is like, it's just how fate changed things.
Right.
So it's like, I think that's fair. It's up to your preference, right? Whatever. I like the idea of the bad guy winning occasionally because that's what
I do
happens.
too.
Right? That's just real, unfortunately. But in general, less so maybe in this one, but I was just curious because one of the things that we talked about in our first episode is just looking at older films and how they stand the test of time. And in this one, maybe one of the tropes in old films is the gay villain and the shorthand of the effete, the effeminate, the sissy bad guy as code for being bad, and it was like shorthand, like you see it in a lot of Disney villains,
Yeah.
lispy kind of things. I was just
Mhm.
wondering, like, I don't know if we go anywhere with this discussion, but like, did you think that's like an element of this? And is there an issue with that? Because I think it's fair to have gay people as villains,
Oh
but
yeah, and
not be villains because they're gay.
no, and like even though I had some of those readings from Tom at the beginning of the movie and kind of throughout, I didn't feel like that was the reason they made him a villain. I think that they explained his psyche well enough to where I believed, I bought what he was doing, and I feel like he wasn't just. They made it fit into his character, so no, that doesn't bother me at all in this movie.
But so this, and I would again, my viewpoint. I don't think the Matt Damon one is problematic in any way either. I don't think
Right?
this is problematic in any way either. I don't think Psycho's version was problematic either, because that wasn't. There's a lot beyond it, beyond just transvestite's a murderer because
Yeah,
he's a transvestite.
yeah.
And I see people talk about that with Silence of the Lambs, and that it's repugnant, but I'm
But
like,
again, that doesn't. I mean, I'm not part of. I'm not trans, so who am I to say? But that doesn't. It doesn't bother me in that movie because they're not saying that he's evil because he's trans.
right. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up because it's just such a thing in this series of movies and
No,
works, right? It's a
well,
core element of the character.
but like you said, oftentimes when that trope does come up, the villain is kind of bumbling and incompetent and is hoisted on his own petard. And even though Tom does get caught supposedly by the end of this movie, not once did I ever think of him as incompetent.
And back to the end of this one, it's like they do leave a little bit of wiggle room of like, he is the talented Mr. Ripley. Maybe he still has a trick up his sleeve.
Yeah, maybe there's a
Probably
way
not.
out of that. No, probably not. But I mean, it is left ambiguous enough.
Right. So, well, I think we got through it. So do we want to wrap up like final thoughts and ratings?
Sure.
I've kind of dominated and led the discussion. So Matt, I definitely want to have you go first on this one.
Well, you know what? I'm very glad that I got to see this movie. It was a movie that I had to really kind of dive into, if not for anything else. And I had to read. It was one of those ones where I had to read the dialogue because I don't speak French as much as I would like to.
Mhm.
But I'm glad I saw this movie. I'm glad I had the bigger context discussion with you because it made me appreciate this movie in a new light. I enjoyed it, but I was confused by a lot of things until we had this discussion, and now I appreciate the nuances a lot more. And I'm excited to see the '90s version, if just for nothing else. And like you said, it's a different interpretation of the material, and I think the material at its core is good. I can see why there's a series based off of this character.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it stands the test of time?
I mean,
Is there value to revisiting this with the modern eyes?
yes, I would say so. I mean, again, get over your aversion to foreign films. It shouldn't be an aversion anyway, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because I think what makes or breaks a good movie is the story, and I think the story is good, and I think it holds up.
Yeah, so jumping into my final thoughts, like I really enjoyed this, and I'll admit maybe I did things the wrong way because I approached it kind of chronologically, and maybe I should have better served for the point of the podcast of watching Purple Noon first. But I think each one of these are super interesting. I couldn't be happier with this first selection because I think there's a lot of depth to it. And the movie by itself, while I think there are a couple, like, I would say kind of tough to argue against flaws, which you can't necessarily get around the Frenchiness of it, a couple things here or there. But beyond that, it's a really interesting interpretation of the source material. I'm not going to go anywhere near the argument because I see people just matter of factly saying this one's better than the Matt Damon one. I don't think that's true at all. I think both are excellent. They're just two different things, right? And I'm not going to rank them. I think that's a waste of energy doing that. Watch both of them. And to the question I posed you, I think this absolutely stands the test of time. It's an interesting character portrayal. It's a it's a really interesting and meaty subject to go back and look at him, and hopefully we did a bit of justice to that of his motivations, to a lesser degree Philippe slash Dickie's character and what his motivations were in that. And yeah, I think this is exactly the kind of thing I was looking for from this, of just not the, you know, the mugging mobster movies from like the 40s, to like real depth of modern kind of filmmaking, but deeper in there. So this is a huge win. I couldn't be happier that I stumbled on this as part of this podcast.
Yeah.
Huge recommend for me. All right, Matt. I think that really ties this one off for June. Should we look forward to what we're going to be doing in July?
Yes, because let's read out the selection for July, because in July it's my turn.
Right. So to remind everybody, the process was the schedule for movies is out for July on Turner Classic Movies. I did the random number generator pre-screen for movies that are reasonably accessible to actually watch. And now it's Matt's turn to pick from the 5 here. He knows what these 5 were, but we'll find out live what his selection is. So the 5 movies that we have to select from for July are 1963's Captain Sinbad. Sinbad takes on an evil wizard to save the princess that he loves. I'm going to go right out on a limb, Matt, and say this is the one I'm definitely hoping for. 1947's They Won't Believe Me. A philandering playboy with a wealthy wife and 2 girlfriends ends up on trial for murder when 2 of the ladies turn up dead, and he's the most likely suspect. 1940's New Moon. A revolutionary leader romances a French aristocrat in Louisiana. Man of the People from 1937. An Italian immigrant studying the law gets mixed up with crooks. And again, I couldn't be happier with how these 2 selections worked, because we have 4 movies I am not really familiar with, and then kind of the ringer selection, which is 1968's Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. An eccentric inventor uses his flying car to free a kingdom of children from oppression.
Which sounds much more epic than the movie actually is.
Which now that brings into question my prediction, because I was predicting you were going to go to the maybe some comfort food of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Okay,
because I might have showed your hand there a little bit.
Because I was going to ask you, like, so you were hoping you're hoping for Sinbad, but I was going to ask you to make your prediction, because I made my prediction last month for you.
Yeah, so my hope, and I think this is something we can do, hope versus prediction, just trying to guess where maybe our trends emerge coming from this, is I hope it's Captain Sinbad, because like I think we want to maybe cover our bases on like deep discussions versus just goofy. And I'm thinking 1963's Captain Sinbad might check the box in goofy. But I do know you kind of like your classics a little bit of like I kind of said, maybe comfort food movies. And I thought Chitty Chitty Bang Bang might be checking the box in that way. And then the other 3 are kind of the wild cards.
Well, I'm glad that I get to surprise you this month then, because, I do like my cinematic comfort food. But I don't remember, if listeners of UP2, let's go way back to one of the episodes that we reviewed. Matt, you happen to know that I also like a few other genres. And one of our best discussions of that series was when we did the episode for Necessary Evil. That's the one where we had to go back to Oda was investigating a crime that happened on the station years past that Kira was involved in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And we discussed the kind of style of that episode. It was a neo-noir throwback to classic, the film noir of the 40s, a murder investigation, kind of a whodunit sort of thing. So with that in mind, my selection for next month is 1947's They Won't Believe Me.
Again, keeping the trend of picking obscure ass movies, pretty much
But
guaranteeing
that was
nobody's gonna pick
But,
us.
but in a sense, I mean, yes, we might have months where we pick comfort food, but this was kind of the point too, is
Oh no,
exploring new things.
I love this. I didn't want to watch Chitty Bang Bang, but I would have, and happily watched it. But
Right.
no, this is like off the radar. Like this is the point. I could not be really ultimately happier that I have to watch something I never ever would have stumbled on
And again,
and
this kind
watched.
of ticks. Reading the short synopsis again, a philandering playboy with a wealthy wife and two girlfriends ends up on trial for murder when two of the ladies turn up dead, and he's the most likely suspect. So it checks off what I think is going to be a noir film. It's a murder mystery. It sounds like there's like procedural law involved, which fits right into my job. So when I was looking through the selections, that's the synopsis that spoke out to me the most.
Oh no, no! I'm gonna have to look up and see if this is based on some pulp crime novel, and
It
I'll
could
have to
be. It
try and
could be.
hit eBay.
It could be absolute trash, but you know what? It appealed to me, so
No,
I'm interested to check it out.
I am all for this. Like, I'm hoping it's got a tight, like, plot driven, just crime something. It makes a lot of sense. No, I'm excited for it. I'm going to be digging for it immediately. So, all right. Should we wrap it up?
Yes, let's wrap it up. What a great first episode. I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Oh,
If this
yeah.
discussion was anything to go by.
It might be the outlier for like really meaty discussion just
Sure.
because of what this was, but no, I think it set the stage for a lot of fun going forward. So with that, I'll say thank you for hanging in with us here, but tune in next month for They Won't Believe Me. And I'm Matt in Buffalo.
And I'm Matt in Arizona. Until then, that's a wrap.